13-year-old Emily Carter had just buried her father. All she had left was an aging tractor that barely ran, a struggling family farm, and a promise she had whispered beside his grave. She would never let their land go. Everyone in town said the same thing. She was too young, too weak, too late. When the old tractor broke down after plowing only a third of the field, her neighbors laughed openly. Some told her to sell the farm before it became another abandoned piece of land. Others shook their heads, saying the little girl had no chance of surviving the coming season. So Emily made a decision that sounded completely foolish. She stopped trying to plow the rest of the field. She left nearly 2/3 of her family's land untouched. People called it the final proof that she had given up. But 7 days later, after the worst flood the valley had seen in more than 50 years, those same people stood frozen, staring at Emily's farm, because beneath the untouched field, something had awakened that no one had known was there. And what it revealed would change not only Emily's future, but the history of the entire valley. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. What city or country are you in, and what time is it there right now? Leave a comment below so I can say hello to our amazing listeners from around the world. If you're just starting your morning, I hope you have a wonderful day ahead. And if you're listening before bed, I hope this story is the perfect way to end your evening. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about family, forgotten legacies, and ordinary people who achieve extraordinary things, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, let's go back to the day everything began. Emily Carter stood beside the fresh mound of earth as the last mourners drifted away from the small country cemetery. The spring wind carried the scent of damp soil across the valley, but she barely noticed. Her hands remained buried in the pockets of her oversized jacket, her fingers wrapped around the folded work gloves that had belonged to her father. Before the casket had disappeared beneath the ground, she had made him one quiet promise. She would never sell the Carter farm, no matter how difficult life became. She would protect the land their family had worked for generations. It was the only promise she had left to give. The drive home was silent. Her grandmother, Martha, stared through the passenger window while Emily gripped the steering wheel of the old pickup, her eyes fixed on the narrow road winding toward the farm. Every fence post, every pasture, every weathered barn carried memories of her father. When the farmhouse finally came into view, Emily felt the weight of the promise settle onto her shoulders. Bills were already piling up on the kitchen table. The bank had called twice that week. Their tractor was older than Emily herself, and half the wheat field still waited to be prepared before planting season slipped away. They had no hired hands anymore. They only had each other. Early the next morning, Emily climbed into the faded green tractor. The engine coughed, sputtered, then finally roared to life with a cloud of gray smoke. She smiled for the first time in days. Her father had taught her every lever, every gear, every strange sound the machine could make. As the tractor crawled across the field, she imagined him walking beside her, nodding with quiet approval. She worked carefully, carving neat rows through the dark earth. Hour after hour passed beneath the warming sun. By midday, she had finished only a third of the field. The machine suddenly jerked forward, rattled violently, and died. Emily tried the ignition again. Nothing. She climbed down and lifted the rusted hood, wiping grease across her hands as she searched for the problem. A cracked belt hung loose beside the engine. She knew enough to understand it wasn't something she could fix with the few tools lying in the toolbox. She sat in the dirt, staring across the untouched field stretching toward the tree line. From the nearby road, a pickup slowed. Wade Turner leaned out the window with 2 other farmers beside him. "Looks like that old tractor finally gave up," he called with a laugh. "You'd save yourself a lot of trouble by selling the place while it's still worth something." One of the men chuckled. No 13-year-old can run a farm alone. Wade shook his head almost sympathetically. Your father worked hard, Emily. Shame to watch all this fall apart. The truck rolled away as laughter drifted behind it. Emily lowered her eyes until the sound disappeared. She wanted to shout after them, but no words came. Instead, she rested her hand against the warm metal of the broken tractor. It wasn't just a machine. It was the last thing her father had driven only weeks before. As evening settled over the valley, Ben Holloway stopped by, carrying a toolbox. He inspected the engine for several minutes before letting out a quiet sigh. That belt's gone, and the pulley isn't much better, he said gently. I'll see if I can find replacement parts, but it may take several days. Emily looked toward the unfinished field. Planting can't wait. Ben nodded sadly. I know. After he left, Martha walked slowly onto the porch, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She watched her granddaughter sitting alone beside the silent tractor. You did everything you could today, she said softly. Emily shook her head. I promised Dad I'd save the farm. Martha looked beyond the field toward the northern edge, where the grass grew thicker than anywhere else. Her expression changed, almost as though an old memory had returned. After a long silence, she spoke so quietly, Emily almost missed the words. Perhaps it's a blessing you couldn't finish plowing. Emily frowned. What do you mean? Martha kept staring at the untouched ground. Your grandfather always said that some land should never be disturbed. Emily followed her gaze toward the unplowed field as the last light faded behind the hills, wondering why those forgotten words suddenly sounded less like an old superstition and more like a warning. The next morning, Emily was awake before sunrise. She stood at the kitchen window, looking across the quiet field where neat rows of freshly turned soil ended abruptly beside the untouched grass. The broken tractor still sat where it had died, a lonely silhouette beneath the pale morning sky. She pulled on her father's worn gloves and walked outside with a small toolbox. She had watched him repair machines for years. Surely there had to be something she could do. She opened the engine cover again and carefully examined every bolt and belt. The cracked drive belt hung uselessly against the pulley. She tightened a few loose fittings and wiped away dirt, but nothing changed. After nearly an hour, she climbed into the seat and turned the key once more. The starter groaned, then fell silent. Emily rested her forehead against the steering wheel. She hated feeling helpless. A pickup rolled into the yard just after breakfast. Ben Holloway stepped out carrying a cardboard box filled with tools. Thought I'd have another look, he said with an encouraging smile. Together, they spent most of the morning taking the damaged parts apart. Ben finally set the broken pulley on the ground and sighed. This piece hasn't been made in years. I know a salvage yard 2 counties over. If anyone has one, it'll be there. Emily looked toward the field. How long? A few days, if we're lucky. She lowered her eyes. Every lost day meant the planting season slipped farther away. Ben noticed the worry on her face. Your father never solved problems by giving up. Neither should you. Before leaving, he gently squeezed her shoulder. I'll be back as soon as I find the part. Emily thanked him, though the empty field seemed larger than ever after his truck disappeared down the road. Later that afternoon, another vehicle stopped outside the farmhouse. Wade Turner climbed out, removing his hat as though he had come on friendly business. Afternoon, Emily. Martha. Martha remained on the porch while Emily walked to the fence. Wade glanced across the property before speaking. You've got good land here. Better than most people realize. Emily stayed silent. Running a farm takes money, equipment, and experience. You don't have any of those. He reached into his jacket and unfolded a paper. I'm willing to make an offer before things get worse. It'll save you both a lot of hardship. Emily didn't even look at the paper. We're not selling. Wade steadied her for a moment. Pride doesn't pay bills. Neither does breaking promises, Emily answered quietly. Wade folded the paper again. Think about it while you still can. Without another word, he climbed back into his truck and drove away. Martha watched until the dust settled on the road. Your grandfather used to get the same look whenever someone tried to buy this place, she said softly. Emily turned toward her. Grandpa really refused every offer? Martha nodded. He always said the farm was worth more than anyone understood. They walked slowly toward the northern edge of the property, where the grass grew taller than the rest of the field. The ground there felt firmer beneath Emily's boots. Martha stopped beside an old oak tree. Your grandfather never let anyone plow this section. Even your father respected that. Did he ever say why? Martha hesitated. Only that someday it would matter. She gave a faint smile. I thought he was simply being stubborn. Emily looked over the untouched land. It appeared no different from any other part of the farm. Yet her grandmother's voice carried a certainty she had never heard before. As they walked farther through the tall grass, Emily noticed something sticking out of the ground near a patch of wildflowers. She knelt and brushed away the dirt. A weathered wooden stake emerged, its top worn smooth by decades of wind and rain. A few steps away stood another, then another. They formed a line, stretching toward the creek beyond the trees. Grandma, Emily called. Have these always been here? Martha stared at the old stakes, her forehead creasing with surprise. I haven't seen those since I was a little girl. There were no markings she could read, only faded cuts carved into the wood long ago. Neither of them knew what the stakes had once measured or why they had been placed so carefully across the field. As the evening breeze swept through the grass, Emily felt as though the forgotten farm was quietly waiting for someone to remember its story. At sunset, the television interrupted the local news with a weather bulletin. A bright red warning stretched across the screen. Meteorologists were tracking an unusually powerful storm system moving toward the valley, with forecasts calling for days of heavy rain and possible flooding. Emily looked from the television to the darkening field outside. Somewhere beyond the window, the old wooden stakes stood silently beneath the gathering clouds. Rain began before dawn, tapping softly against the farmhouse roof. By breakfast, it had settled into a steady rhythm that seemed determined to wash the color from the valley. Emily stood on the porch with a cup of warm tea clasped between both hands, watching dark clouds swallow the distant hills. The unfinished field stretched before her, its freshly plowed rows already darkening with moisture, while the untouched northern section remained covered with thick grass that bent gently beneath the rain. Martha joined her, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Neither of them spoke for a while. They simply listened to the rain. It's early for a storm like this, Martha finally murmured. Emily nodded. Do you think it'll stop by tomorrow? Martha looked toward the swollen creek beyond the trees. I hope so. By midday, the rain had only grown heavier. Water dripped from every fence rail and streamed through the ditches beside the gravel road. Emily pulled on her boots and walked toward the tractor, hoping one more inspection might reveal something Ben had missed. She knew it was unlikely, but standing still felt worse than trying. The engine remained silent. As she closed the hood, she noticed something strange. Water, flowing across the freshly plowed field, pooled in shallow puddles. Exactly as she expected. But the rain falling onto the untouched northern section seemed to disappear almost immediately. instead of collecting on the surface. It vanished beneath the grass, as though the earth itself were drinking it. Curious. Emily stepped into the taller grass. The ground was firm beneath her boots despite the rain. She crouched and watched tiny streams weaving naturally between the old wooden stakes she had found the previous evening. None of the water lingered. It all slipped quietly downhill toward the creek. She followed one narrow channel for several yards before losing it beneath thick roots and wild plants. "That's odd," she whispered. She had lived on the farm her entire life, yet she had never noticed the water moving this way. A truck engine rumbled across the yard. Ben Holloway climbed out, wearing a raincoat soaked nearly black. He carried no replacement parts. Emily recognized the answer before he spoke. "No luck?" she asked. Ben shook his head. The salvage yard had 3 old tractors. None used the pulley you need. He looked genuinely disappointed. "I'm not giving up, but it'll take longer." Emily forced a smile. "Thanks for trying." Ben noticed her staring toward the northern field. "Something wrong?" She pointed toward the disappearing streams. "The water isn't collecting over there." Ben adjusted his cap against the rain and followed her across the field. Together they watched another sheet of rain strike the grass. Once again the water vanished almost immediately. Ben frowned. "Well, I'll be." He knelt and pushed aside a clump of grass with one hand. Beneath it, the soil felt damp, but not muddy. Tiny trickles of water slipped through narrow depressions, almost hidden beneath decades of growth. "I've seen something like this before," he said quietly. Emily looked up hopefully. "Where?" Ben stood slowly, staring across the valley. "When I was a boy, your grandfather talked about letting water find its own path instead of fighting it." He gave a faint laugh. Most folks thought he spent too much time thinking about rain. "Did he build these channels?" Emily asked. Ben rubbed his chin. "I honestly don't know. Your father never mentioned them either." Before either of them could say more, the distant sound of engines echoed from the county road. Several farmers drove past with trailers loaded high with seed and equipment, hurrying to finish work before the weather became worse. Wade Turner slowed his truck near the Carter property and rolled down his window. "Still waiting on that tractor," he called. Ben answered before Emily could. "Parts are hard to find," Wade shrugged. "Doesn't matter now. Once this rain passes, everyone else will be planting while you're still standing here." His eyes swept across the unfinished field. "That untouched land isn't doing you any favors." Emily said nothing. Wade tipped his hat and continued down the road. Ben watched him disappear. "He's worried about crops. That's all he sees." Emily looked back toward the hidden streams. Maybe Grandpa saw something different. The rain continued without pause through the afternoon and into the night. By the following morning, every pond in the valley had risen. The creek behind the farm had become a fast-moving brown river, carrying broken branches downstream. Local radio stations repeated flood advisories every hour. Emily drove with Martha into town for supplies. Sandbags sat stacked outside the hardware store. People gathered beneath the awning, discussing weather reports with uneasy voices. One man pointed toward the river. "Haven't seen it climb this fast in years," another replied. "If this keeps up another day, we'll have trouble." Emily noticed that even Wade no longer wore his usual confident expression as he loaded feed into his truck. Everyone glanced toward the dark sky before returning to work. Back at the farm, the rain fell even harder. Emily walked once more to the northern field. Water still disappeared into the hidden channels before reaching the surface. She placed one boot beside an old wooden stake and imagined someone setting it there decades earlier with careful purpose. "What were you trying to protect?" she whispered. A sudden crack of thunder rolled across the valley, followed by a deep sound unlike anything she had heard before. It was low, heavy, and distant, yet powerful enough to make the ground beneath her feet seem to tremble. Ben, who had just arrived with fresh weather updates, turned instantly toward the river. His face lost its color. Another rumble echoed through the rain. "That's not thunder," he said quietly. Emily stared toward the valley below. "Then what is it?" Ben didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon where the river disappeared beyond the trees. Finally, he spoke the words neither of them wanted to hear. "I think the main levee just cracked." The deep rumble rolled across the valley a second time. Louder now, followed by the sharp wail of emergency sirens from town. Emily and Ben exchanged frightened glances before hurrying toward the porch, where Martha had already turned on the battery-powered radio. The announcer's usually calm voice was strained. "Residents living near the river are urged to move livestock and equipment to higher ground immediately. Officials have confirmed structural damage to the main levee. Floodwaters may reach the valley within hours." Martha quietly lowered the volume. No one spoke. They all knew there wasn't enough time to save everything. Ben broke the silence first. "I'll help anyone I can. Then come back if you're in trouble." Emily nodded. "Please be careful." He climbed into his truck and disappeared through the curtain of rain. The storm intensified throughout the afternoon. Sheets of water swept across the fields, flattening young crops and filling every ditch until they overflowed. Emily and Martha worked together without wasting a minute. They carried tools into the barn loft, moved family photographs upstairs, and opened every gate so frightened animals could reach higher pasture if the fences failed. The old farmhouse creaked beneath the wind, but it stood firm. As evening approached, the creek behind the property no longer looked like a creek at all. It had become part of a broad, rushing river stretching across the lower fields. Emily stood beneath the porch roof, watching tree branches race past in the muddy current. "I've never seen water move this fast," she whispered. Martha rested a hand on her shoulder. "Neither have I." Just before sunset, headlights appeared through the rain. Wade Turner's truck bounced wildly into the Carter driveway, followed by two trailers packed tightly with nervous cattle. His clothes were soaked, his face pale. There was no trace of the confident man who had offered to buy the farm only a day before. He stepped out and hurried toward Emily. "The south pasture's gone," he said breathlessly. "The river broke through the fence line." He glanced toward the higher ground behind the Carter barn. "I hate asking this, but can I move my herd onto your hillside?" Emily looked at Martha. Her grandmother gave a small nod before either of them spoke. "Of course," Emily answered. Relief washed across Wade's face. "Thank you." Together they opened gates while frightened cattle stumbled toward the safest ground on the property. Noah jumped from the second truck and worked silently beside Emily, guiding the animals through the rain. "Thanks," he said quietly when the last cow reached the pasture. Emily simply nodded. There was no room left for old arguments. Nature had made everyone equal that night. Darkness settled early beneath the heavy clouds. Then the flood arrived. A roaring wall of muddy water rushed across the lower valley, swallowing fences, machinery, and freshly plowed fields. Emily watched from the porch as entire sections of farmland disappeared beneath churning brown water. The carefully prepared rows on neighboring farms dissolved into thick waves of mud. Broken fence posts floated past like driftwood. Wade stood beside Ben, who had returned after helping several families farther down the road. None of them spoke. They could only watch. Then Ben pointed toward the northern field. Emily. She followed his hand. The untouched section of grass still stood. Water rushed toward it from every direction. Yet instead of washing it away, the flood seemed to slow. The tall grass bent beneath the force, but beneath it, something unseen guided the water sideways. Long, shallow streams spread across the field before flowing steadily toward the creek beyond the trees. The old wooden stakes, barely visible above the grass, remained standing. The untouched ground was holding. Ben stared in disbelief. I've never seen anything like that. Even Wade could only shake his head. That field should be underwater. Emily remembered her grandmother's words. Some land should never be disturbed. She looked at Martha, who silently wiped away tears. Your grandfather knew, she whispered. The rain finally began to weaken shortly before dawn. By sunrise, the floodwaters had started to retreat, leaving behind thick layers of mud, broken branches, and scattered debris across the valley. Farmers slowly emerged from their homes to inspect the damage. Everywhere Emily looked, she saw ruined crops and collapsed fences. Her own freshly plowed section had suffered heavy erosion, but the untouched northern field remained almost exactly as it had before the storm. As Ben, Wade, Noah, Martha, and Emily walked across the damp grass, Emily noticed something unusual near the center of the field. The rushing water had stripped away decades of soil from one small patch of ground. Beneath the exposed earth lay a flat stone slab, unlike the surrounding rock. Its edges were straight, almost perfectly shaped by human hands. Half buried in the mud was a rusted iron ring fixed into the center of the stone. Emily knelt and brushed away more dirt with trembling fingers. Ben, she called softly. He crouched beside her, his eyes widening. That's no ordinary stone. Together they cleared away another layer of mud until the full outline became visible. It was a heavy stone door, hidden beneath the field for longer than anyone could remember. Emily wrapped both hands around the rusted iron ring and pulled. It refused to move. Mud clung tightly around the edges of the stone slab, sealing it in place after decades beneath the earth. Ben knelt beside her and pushed his shovel carefully beneath one corner. Let's not force it, he said. If this has been here as long as I think, we don't want to crack anything. Wade and Noah, still helping clean storm debris from the farm, walked over after noticing the group gathered in the field. Wade looked down at the exposed stone. What in the world is that? Ben wiped mud from his hands. Looks like some kind of underground entrance. Without another word, Wade set his pride aside and grabbed another shovel. For the next hour, the 5 of them worked together, clearing away wet soil and tangled roots from around the slab. Emily found it strange how different everything felt after the flood. Only days earlier, Wade had tried to buy the farm and laughed when her tractor failed. Now he silently dug beside her, stopping only to catch his breath. At last, Ben slipped the shovel beneath the edge again. This time, the stone shifted with a low, grinding sound. Everyone together, he said. They gripped the iron ring and the edge of the slab. With one final effort, the heavy door slowly lifted, releasing a rush of cool, damp air from below. A narrow stone staircase disappeared into darkness. Emily stared into the opening. Grandpa built this. Martha stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the hidden stairway. I never knew this existed. Ben found an old lantern in the barn and lit it. We'll go slowly. He descended first, followed by Emily. Martha remained near the entrance, while Wade and Noah waited just behind them. The stone steps led about 15 feet underground before opening into a long, narrow chamber. The air smelled of wet earth and iron. Emily lifted the lantern higher. The walls were lined with carefully fitted stone blocks instead of bare dirt. Water flowed quietly through a channel running down the center of the floor. "This wasn't a cellar," Ben whispered. "It was built for water." They followed the passage a short distance until the lantern light revealed several large steel wheels mounted beside the channel. Thick iron rods disappeared into the walls. Though stained with rust, the mechanisms remained remarkably solid. Emily reached toward one wheel, but stopped. "Should I touch it?" Ben examined the structure carefully. "Let's see if it still moves." Together, they placed their hands on one of the wheels. It resisted at first, then slowly turned with a deep metallic groan. Somewhere farther down the tunnel came the sound of rushing water changing direction. Emily's eyes widened. "It still works." Ben nodded in amazement. After all these years. The hidden channel beneath them carried water steadily toward the creek beyond the northern field. Emily suddenly understood why rain had disappeared beneath the grass instead of flooding the surface. Whatever her grandfather had built had continued doing its job long after people had forgotten it existed. They explored farther through the chamber. Every few yards, another control wheel connected to branching channels beneath the farm. The workmanship was careful and deliberate, built to last generations instead of seasons. Wade slowly removed his cap. One man couldn't have dug all this alone. Martha looked around the chamber. "Your grandfather worked every winter after harvest," she said quietly. "He always came home exhausted, but he never told anyone what he was doing." She smiled sadly. "I thought he was repairing old fences somewhere." Near the far wall, Emily noticed a wooden cabinet protected from the moisture by a metal cover. The hinges squeaked as she carefully opened it. Inside rested several rolled sheets of thick paper tied with faded cloth ribbon. She handed them to Ben, who gently untied the bundle. The first sheet unfolded into a hand-drawn map of the Carter farm. Blue ink marked narrow channels running beneath the fields, exactly where the hidden waterways now flowed. Additional lines extended beyond the property toward neighboring farms and the creek. Small handwritten notes filled the margins, recording depths, slopes, and water flow. Ben studied the map in silence before looking at Emily. "Your grandfather planned every foot of this." Emily traced one blue line with her finger until it reached the northern field where the old wooden stakes still stood. Those weathered markers suddenly made sense. They had not been random at all. They marked something important beneath the ground. As Ben carefully rolled up the map again, a single sentence written across the lower corner caught Emily's attention. Unlike the detailed measurements surrounding it, these words had been written in larger letters, almost like a warning, meant to be noticed first. She leaned closer and read them aloud. "Do not disturb the northern field." Emily carefully rolled the map back into its faded ribbon and placed it on the cabinet, while Ben searched the remaining papers. Most were hand-drawn sketches showing measurements, water depths, and small adjustments made over the years. Beneath them rested a leather-bound notebook with cracked edges and a brass clasp darkened by age. Ben lifted it gently and brushed away a thin layer of dust. "This looks more personal," he said. Emily accepted the notebook with both hands. The first page carried only a name written in careful script. Thomas Carter, her grandfather. She glanced toward Martha, who stood quietly at the entrance to the chamber. Tears had already gathered in her eyes before Emily turned the page. The journal did not begin with stories about crops or family life. Instead, it described rainfall, river levels, and flooding that had struck the valley decades earlier. Thomas had carefully recorded dates, water heights, and the damage done to neighboring farms. As the entries continued, the writing slowly changed from observations into plans. "The valley cannot survive another flood like the last one," one entry read. "The river must be guided, not resisted." Emily looked up. "He really planned all of this." Ben nodded. "Looks that way." They continued reading together. Thomas explained that ordinary drainage ditches filled too quickly during heavy storms. Instead, he believed water should be spread beneath the surface through hidden channels that slowed its force before returning it safely to the creek. The notes described years of testing, failures, and improvements. Every winter, he expanded another section beneath the northern field. Emily pictured her grandfather leaving the farmhouse each cold morning with tools over his shoulder while everyone assumed he was repairing fences. She suddenly understood why he always returned home exhausted. Martha wiped her eyes. He never wanted praise. If someone thanked him for fixing a fence, he'd simply smile and change the subject. Another journal entry caught Emily's attention. "Presented my design at the town meeting today. They laughed, said the cost was too high and the danger exaggerated." She looked at Ben. They didn't believe him. Ben gave a slow shake of his head. Back then, people trusted the levy. They probably thought he was worrying over nothing. The following pages revealed that Thomas had continued anyway. Unable to convince the town, he sold machinery, worked extra jobs during the winter, and spent nearly every spare dollar building the underground system himself beneath the family farm. Emily ran her fingers across the faded handwriting. He did all this alone. "Not alone," Martha whispered. "Your father helped once he was old enough." Emily looked toward her grandmother. Martha smiled through her tears. "Every Saturday, they disappeared before sunrise. I thought they were hunting or cutting firewood. They never told me the truth because they knew I'd worry about the money they were spending." Ben quietly closed the journal for a moment. "Your father never mentioned any of this to me." Martha lowered her eyes. "Thomas made him promise not to. He believed the work would speak for itself if it was ever needed." Silence filled the chamber as water continued flowing through the stone channel beside them. The hidden system had kept working for years without anyone realizing it existed. Emily opened the journal again. Later entries described maintenance rather than construction. Thomas carefully inspected every gate and valve after major storms, recording small repairs and changes in water flow. One note mentioned replacing wooden markers across the northern field after harsh winters damaged the originals. Emily remembered the weathered stakes rising from the grass. They had never been simple fence posts. They marked the path of the buried channels. Near the final pages, the handwriting became less steady. Thomas wrote about growing older and worrying whether someone would continue maintaining the system after he was gone. "If these channels are neglected," one passage warned, "the valley will eventually forget why the northern field must remain untouched." Emily swallowed hard. She had almost plowed that very ground herself only days earlier. If the tractor had not broken down, the hidden waterways beneath the grass might have been damaged before anyone knew they existed. Ben rested one hand gently on her shoulder. "Sometimes life protects us in ways we don't understand." Emily looked toward the flowing water and quietly nodded. As she turned the final pages, she noticed several references to another document. Thomas repeatedly mentioned making revisions after consulting the master drawing. Yet no folded blueprint remained inside the cabinet. Emily searched beneath the journal and through every rolled map once more. Nothing. One final note, written in darker ink than the others, had been underlined twice. "The master drawing has been secured separately for safekeeping." Emily read the sentence aloud. Ben frowned thoughtfully. "Then this isn't everything." Martha looked around the stone chamber as though trying to remember something long forgotten. "If your grandfather hid that drawing somewhere else," she said softly, "he must have had a reason." The notebook remained open on the wooden cabinet as Emily climbed back into the morning light. The air smelled of wet grass and fresh earth after the flood, and for the first time, the northern field no longer looked ordinary. Every patch of grass, every weathered stake, every gentle slope now seemed to hide a purpose, carefully planned decades before. Ben lowered the stone door again, covering the entrance until they could return with proper equipment. "No need for curious visitors just yet," he said. Emily agreed. The underground system had survived because it had remained forgotten. They walked slowly toward the barn, each lost in thought. Martha paused halfway across the yard and looked toward the old wooden structure. "Your grandfather spent almost as much time in that barn as he did in the fields." Emily glanced at her. "Do you think he hid the master drawing there?" Martha hesitated. "I can't say for certain, but if he wanted it close without anyone finding it, that would have been the place." The barn had stood on the Carter property for nearly 80 years. Emily had played inside it countless times as a child, climbing hay bales and helping her father stack feed. Yet she had never thought of it as a place that could hide secrets. They began searching carefully rather than tearing things apart. Ben examined old shelves while Emily checked wooden chests filled with rusted tools and worn harnesses. Noah quietly joined them without being asked. "Dad's helping clear debris by the river," he explained. "I figured another pair of hands couldn't hurt." Emily smiled gratefully. Hours passed with little success. They found old farm ledgers, broken lanterns, faded family photographs, and machinery parts that had not been used in decades. Every discovery offered another glimpse into the Carter family's past, but nothing resembling the missing drawing. Finally, Ben leaned against a workbench and laughed softly. "Your grandfather was a better carpenter than I remembered." Emily brushed dust from her hands. "Why do you say that?" "Because if he hid something, he certainly didn't make it easy." Martha slowly crossed the barn, her fingers trailing along one weathered wall. She stopped beside an old grain storage bin that had not been used in years. "Help me move this." Together, Ben and Noah slid the heavy bin several inches away from the wall. Behind it, the wooden boards looked no different from the rest of the barn, except for a narrow seam running vertically between two planks. Ben pressed gently against one board. It shifted inward with a soft click. A hidden compartment, no wider than a bookshelf, appeared inside the wall. Emily's heart pounded. Resting on a single wooden shelf was a long metal tube sealed with a brass cap. Beside it lay a small envelope addressed simply, "For the next caretaker." Emily carefully lifted the tube. Despite its age, it felt dry and surprisingly well preserved. She unscrewed the cap and slowly pulled out a tightly rolled sheet of thick paper. Ben helped spread it across the nearby workbench. It was larger than every map they had found beneath the field. Fine blue lines stretched far beyond the Carter property. The underground channels continued beneath neighboring farms, crossed beneath the county road, and connected with streams feeding the entire valley. Detailed measurements filled every margin. Ben stared silently for several moments before speaking. This wasn't designed for one farm. Emily followed the lines with her finger. It reaches almost everywhere. Martha looked down at the drawing in disbelief. "Thomas never told me." Ben nodded slowly. "He built the heart of the system here, but he planned for the whole watershed." Emily realized her grandfather had never thought only about protecting his own crops. Every channel had been placed to slow floodwater before it reached homes and fields downstream. Noah looked toward the northern field through the open barn door. If that system hadn't been there... He never finished the sentence. None of them needed him to. Ben gently folded the blueprint back into its tube before opening the small envelope. Inside was a short, handwritten note. "If you are reading this," he said quietly, "then someone has remembered why this place matters. Protect the channels, and they will protect others." Emily recognized the careful handwriting immediately. She closed her eyes for a moment before smiling through tears. Ben placed the note back into the envelope. "Your father knew." Emily looked up. "How can you tell?" "The dust on this shelf is years old," Ben replied. "But the envelope isn't. Someone opened this compartment long after your grandfather was gone." Martha slowly nodded. "It had to be your father. He kept his promise." Emily looked around the old barn with new understanding. Her father had quietly maintained the system exactly as his own father had done, never asking for recognition. The responsibility had simply passed from one generation to the next. Before anyone could say more, the sound of engines echoed from the driveway. 2 county trucks stopped outside the farmhouse. Men wearing reflective jackets stepped out, carrying measuring equipment and clipboards. One of them introduced himself as a county engineer. "We've been surveying flood damage across the valley," he explained. His eyes drifted toward the northern field. "We've been told your property behaved very differently during the storm." Ben and Emily exchanged a brief glance. The secret they had just uncovered was no longer theirs alone. The county engineers spent the morning walking across the Carter farm with measuring rods, survey flags, and notebooks. Emily stayed close beside Ben, while Martha watched quietly from the porch. The lead engineer, Mr. Collins, paused often to examine the northern field, kneeling to inspect the weathered wooden stakes and the unusual flow of water still moving beneath the grass. "I've never seen drainage behave like this on natural ground," he admitted. "It shouldn't be possible without some kind of engineered system." Emily glanced at Ben, who gave a slight nod. There was no longer any reason to hide the truth. Ben led the engineers to the stone entrance in the field. Together, they lifted the heavy slab once again. Mr. Collins descended first, followed by 2 assistants carrying flashlights. For several minutes, the only sounds reaching the surface were distant echoes of footsteps and quiet voices. Finally, the group returned, each wearing the same astonished expression. Mr. Collins removed his hard hat and looked directly at Emily. "Who built this?" "My grandfather," she answered. "Thomas Carter." The engineer slowly shook his head. "This system is extraordinary, even by today's standards. The design is remarkably efficient. The channels slowed the flood before it reached the lower properties. Had this section of the field been fully plowed, much of the underground network could have collapsed." Emily remembered the broken tractor and felt a chill. Only a single mechanical failure had kept the northern field untouched. Mr. Collins continued, "Your grandfather understood something many engineers still teach today. Water moves more safely when it's guided instead of blocked." Wade stood a few yards away, listening in silence. His eyes drifted toward his own farm across the valley, where muddy scars still stretched across fields that had been carefully plowed only days earlier. After the engineers finished their inspection, he slowly walked toward Emily. "I owe you an apology," he said. Emily looked up, surprised by the quietness in his voice. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Wade took off his cap. "For years, I filled in every old ditch and shallow channel on my land because I thought they were wasting space. I wanted straighter fields and bigger harvests." He looked toward the northern field. "Now I realize those channels were probably connected to this whole system." Ben folded his arms. "Your grandfather warned people not to remove them." Wade gave a tired smile. I thought I knew better. Noah stood beside his father without speaking, but Emily noticed the respect in his eyes as he looked across the Carter farm. Later that afternoon, Mr. Collins asked permission to examine old county records connected to the property. Emily gladly agreed. By evening, he returned carrying several photocopied documents from the town archive. They gathered around the kitchen table while rain clouds finally gave way to clear skies outside. The engineer carefully spread the papers across the table. One document listed flood control proposals submitted decades earlier. Another contained minutes from a town council meeting. Emily searched every page until she found her grandfather's name. Thomas Carter had presented a comprehensive water management plan to local officials many years before. Beside the proposal was a short, handwritten note. Recommendation declined due to projected cost. Emily frowned. That's all, Mr. Collins nodded. Apparently, the project was never officially adopted. Ben continued reading the file. But the ideas were recorded. Mr. Collins unfolded one final document. Not exactly. He pointed to a later engineering report, created several years afterward. Many of the same concepts appeared throughout the report, but the author listed was someone else entirely. Thomas Carter's name appeared nowhere. Martha slowly lowered herself into a chair. They erased him. Silence filled the room. Emily stared at the pages, unable to understand how someone could spend years building something that protected an entire valley and simply disappear from the record. Mr. Collins spoke carefully. I can't explain why this happened, but these documents raise serious questions. Ben gently closed the folder. Questions we'll answer. Emily looked again at the blueprint, the journal, and the copied records spread across the table. For the first time, she understood that her grandfather's greatest achievement had not been forgotten by accident. Somewhere between his original proposal and the official report, his contribution had vanished. As the evening sun broke through the clouds, its light reached the old journal lying beside the county records. Emily opened it one more time, hoping she had overlooked something before. Tucked between two final pages was a thin sheet of folded paper she had not noticed earlier. Unlike the journal entries, this page was not written by her grandfather. It was a typed copy of an official meeting record. Near the bottom, one sentence had been circled in pencil long ago. Emily read it slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Original design attribution removed from the final report. She looked up in stunned silence as everyone around the table realized the same painful truth. The room remained silent after Emily read the circled sentence aloud. The typed page rested on the kitchen table beside her grandfather's journal. The master drawing and the county records. Together they told a story that no one in the valley had ever been allowed to hear. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses and carefully compared the documents once more. These records match the dates in your grandfather's journal, he said. The engineering proposal came first. The later report borrowed the same concepts, but the original designer's name disappeared. Ben folded his arms. Thomas wasn't mistaken. He was ignored. Martha gently placed her hand over the worn journal. He never complained. Her voice trembled with both sadness and pride. He simply kept working. Emily looked toward the window, where the northern field shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Her grandfather had never stopped maintaining the hidden channels, even after losing recognition for the idea. He had chosen to protect people instead of proving himself right. That realization hurt more than any unfair record ever could. Mr. Collins carefully gathered the copies into a folder. I'll be submitting these findings to the county office, he said. The evidence is stronger than I expected. Emily nodded quietly. She wasn't thinking about awards or official reports. She was thinking about the promise her grandfather had carried in silence for so many years. The following morning, several neighbors arrived at the Carter farm. News of the underground water system had spread quickly through the valley. Some came out of curiosity, others to offer help after the flood. Wade was among the first to step forward. He removed his cap before speaking. "Emily, Martha, I owe both of you more than an apology." Emily looked at him without saying anything. Wade continued, "I laughed when your tractor broke down. I tried to buy this farm because I believed it had no future." He glanced toward the northern field. "Turns out the only land that survived the flood was the land I told you was worthless." Emily remembered standing beside the silent tractor while Wade's truck drove away only days before. Everything had changed since then. "I'm sorry," Wade said simply. "I was wrong." Emily offered a small smile. "Thank you." Noah stepped beside his father. "If you're rebuilding fences or clearing debris, I'd like to help." Ben smiled. "We won't say no to extra hands." Before long, more neighbors joined them. Broken fence posts were replaced, washed-out paths repaired, and storm debris gathered into neat piles. No one had organized the effort. It simply happened. People who had once doubted the Carter farm now worked together across its fields. During a break, Ben carried the master drawing into the barn, where several neighbors had gathered. He carefully unrolled the blueprint across the old workbench. "Look here," he said, pointing to the blue lines stretching beyond the Carter property. "These channels don't stop at the fence." Farmers leaned closer. One recognized markings beneath his own pasture. Another remembered shallow ditches his grandfather had once insisted on preserving. Wade stared at the drawing for a long time before quietly speaking. "I filled in every one of those channels on my side, years ago." Mr. Collins, who had returned with additional survey notes, nodded thoughtfully. "That likely increased the pressure during the flood." Wade sighed. "Then I'll reopen them." Several other farmers exchanged glances before agreeing to inspect their own properties. For the first time in decades, the old water system was being understood as a network rather than a collection of forgotten ditches. Emily watched the conversation unfold with quiet amazement. Her grandfather's work was beginning to guide people once again. Later that afternoon, the county office contacted Mr. Collins with preliminary findings. He shared the update with everyone gathered outside the farmhouse. "The historical records support everything we've discovered," he announced. Thomas Carter designed the original drainage concept years before the official flood management report was published. Ben smiled proudly. Martha quietly wiped away another tear. Emily looked toward the sky, wishing her father could have heard those words. He had protected the truth his entire life without asking for recognition. Now, that truth finally belonged to everyone. As the sun lowered behind the hills, neighbors spread across the valley, carrying shovels and simple surveying tools. Guided by the master drawing, they began locating the old drainage paths that had slowly disappeared beneath decades of farming. Some channels needed clearing, others would require rebuilding. The work would take time, but no one complained. They now understood why the northern field had survived when everything else had flooded. Before leaving for the evening, Mr. Collins approached Emily with a warm smile. "The county commissioners are meeting next week," he said. "After everything we've documented, they've decided to hold a public ceremony." Emily looked surprised. "For what?" "To officially recognize Thomas Carter's contribution to protecting this valley." Emily glanced across the farm, where neighbors still worked together beneath the fading light. The hidden channels had carried water for decades without anyone noticing. Soon, at last, the man who built them would no longer remain hidden either. The morning of the ceremony dawned bright and clear, the kind of spring day that seemed to promise new beginnings. For the first time since her father's funeral, Emily stood on the porch without feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing against her chest. The Carter farm still bore scars from the flood, but repaired fences stretched across the hills again. The barn stood strong, and the northern field swayed peacefully beneath a gentle breeze. The old tractor remained parked beside the shed, still waiting for its replacement parts. But Emily smiled whenever she looked at it. The machine had failed at exactly the moment that had saved everything. Martha stepped onto the porch, carrying a neatly folded shirt that had once belonged to Emily's father. "I thought you might like to wear this today," she said softly. Emily ran her fingers across the familiar fabric before putting it on. Though the sleeves were slightly too long, it felt right. It felt as though part of her father was walking beside her once again. By late morning, nearly the entire valley had gathered near the town square. Farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, and families filled the rows of folding chairs facing a small wooden platform decorated with spring flowers. County officials stood beside Mr. Collins, while Ben waited quietly near the front. Wade and Noah arrived together and immediately crossed the crowd to greet Emily and Martha. "Fence repairs are almost finished," Wade said with a smile. "And we've already reopened 2 of the old drainage channels on my property." Ben nodded approvingly. "That's a good start." More neighbors shared similar news. Across the valley, forgotten ditches were being restored, blocked waterways reopened, and old maps compared with the master drawing. Thomas Carter's work had become more than a family secret. It had become a guide for rebuilding the entire community. When the ceremony began, the county commissioners stepped to the podium. He spoke first about the recent flood and the damage it had caused throughout the valley. Then he described one small farm that had withstood the disaster because of a hidden system no one had remembered. Finally, he held up a copy of the restored engineering records. "Today," he announced, "we officially recognize Thomas Carter as the original designer of the underground flood management system that helped protect this valley." Applause spread through the crowd. Martha quietly lowered her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. Ben smiled without saying a word. Emily stood frozen for a moment, wishing her grandfather and father could somehow hear what was finally being said aloud. The commissioner continued by presenting Martha and Emily with a framed certificate honoring Thomas Carter's contribution to the community. Beneath the official seal were simple words that meant more than any award. In grateful recognition of a legacy that protected generations, Emily accepted the frame with trembling hands. It was not the paper itself that mattered. It was the truth, finally finding its way home. After the ceremony, neighbors gathered around the Carter family. Some apologized for never asking questions years earlier. Others shared memories of Thomas quietly helping repair roads, clear creeks, or advise younger farmers without expecting anything in return. Piece by piece, a fuller picture of the man emerged. He had spent a lifetime serving people who often never realized how much he had given them. Before everyone left, the commissioner made one final announcement. The county would preserve the underground water system, protect the northern field from future development, and use Thomas Carter's design as a model for future flood management projects throughout the region. Emily looked toward Ben, who smiled proudly. "Your grandfather finally has partners," he whispered. Weeks passed, and life slowly settled into a new rhythm. Replacement parts arrived for the old tractor, and with Ben's help, Emily brought the machine back to life. It rattled and smoked exactly as it always had, making her laugh the first time the engine started again. Together with Martha, Ben, Noah, and even Wade, she prepared the fields for planting. This time, no one suggested disturbing the northern field. Instead, they carefully worked around it, respecting the hidden channels beneath the grass exactly as Thomas had instructed decades earlier. Summer arrived, and green shoots soon covered the repaired fields. The Carter farm became a place visitors came to study rather than pity. Agricultural students walked the property with county engineers. Farmers from neighboring towns asked Ben and Emily to explain how the old drainage system worked. Emily always began with the same words. It wasn't built to save one farm. It was built to help everyone. As harvest season approached, the valley enjoyed one of its healthiest crops in years. The restored waterways carried away heavy rains without damaging fields, and many farmers quietly admitted that reopening the forgotten channels had made a remarkable difference. One evening, after the last wagon had returned from the fields, Martha called Emily into the farmhouse. From an old wooden cabinet, she removed a small iron key attached to a faded leather strap. "Your grandfather carried this," she said. "Then your father did." Emily recognized the shape immediately. It fit the hidden chamber beneath the northern field. Martha gently placed the key into Emily's hand. "Every generation has someone who protects this place," she said. "Now it's your turn." Emily closed her fingers around the cool metal. She understood that the real inheritance had never been the land itself. It had been the responsibility to care for something larger than her own family. At sunset, she walked alone across the northern field. Warm light spread across the tall grass as a gentle breeze moved through it. Beneath her feet, unseen channels quietly guided clear water toward the creek, exactly as they had for decades. She stopped beside one of the weathered wooden stakes and looked across the valley. Children played near rebuilt fences. Farmers worked together in fields that had once been divided by pride. The land her neighbors had laughed at had become the land that helped save them all. Emily smiled as she slipped the old key into her pocket. She had promised her father she would never sell the farm. Now she finally understood why that promise had mattered so much. She was never simply protecting a piece of land. She was protecting a forgotten legacy of quiet kindness, patient wisdom, and selfless work that continued to flow beneath the valley, just like the hidden water that had always found its way home.